Okay, so we pick up where we left off as far as the tensions with England. We concluded yesterday with mercantilism. Remember the idea or economic theory in which the stronger nation, the mother nation, will extract raw goods from the particular colony. They then will bring those raw materials to the motherland and they will finish the product. Remember the illustration with logging as far as that and making furniture and then forcing the colonies to buy the furniture. So these are the things that's happening within the colonies that are frustrating the colonists themselves. So politically they're oppressed. They can't have the kind of political system that they are in favor of. They've come all this way from across the Atlantic. They're still experiencing political oppression. They are experiencing economic oppression. And things is only going to get worse because now we are dealing with the French and Indian War. This particular war is going to pit Britain and their Native American allies against France and their Native American allies. And the colonists are going to be forced to really want to stay neutral and just do their own thing. Many of the colonists are going to be forced by the British to fight against the French and their Native American allies. And things are going to get drastically worse as far as that is concerned. So let me just give you a little bit of content development or backstory with that. Now, of course, the British are going to be able to defeat the French. The colonists are going to be able to be successful as well. And so now the British are going to inherit all of the land that was once New France. This then is going to allow the colonists to be able to migrate westward. When I say westward, I'm talking about land that we would know of as Tennessee or Kentucky, maybe as far as Arkansas. That's about as far west as would we be going. What we associate today as the Midwest. However, when we started to migrate west, we find that there are Native American resistance. So England does something with the proclamation line of 1763, basically saying that, if you you're not allowed to go past the Appalachian Mountains. And so this angers the colonists that much the more. They say to themselves, we helped you win the French and Indian War and you will not let us go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so this is frustrating to the colonists. Here they helped win the French and Indian War, but now they're being told that they can't go and inhabit that land or, settle that land. So the proclamation line of 1763 is a stepping stone to, there again, the creation of the American Revolution. So there's a lot of problems going on right now in the colonies. To pay for the French and Indian War, the British Empire is going to ask that the colonists pay their fair share of taxes, okay, more for that matter. So the next slide will there again inform us a little bit of this. All right, so other tensions with England are going to be in and around the French and Indian War. While the French and Indian War is in progression, England was busy exerting their power elsewhere. So their power was not solely, dedicated to the colonists. The colonists were left to govern themselves. They grow accustomed to this. They like the idea that England is not so hands-on with them. So they grow accustomed to the idea of self-control. And once the French and Indian War concludes and they come back to, what you would say, their dictatorial ways, the colonists, are going to be that much the more resentful, that much the more frustrated. Salutary neglect is another tension that is going to arise with England. The whole idea as well as far as taxation and representation. Many Americans protested under the cry, there again, of the infamous quote, no taxation without representation. Prime Minister Grenville shot back that all members of Parliament represented the interest of all British subjects in the empire, no matter where they lived. So because they were a product of England, they would have to pay that tax. Colonial critics ridiculed the doctrine of virtual representation, believing that a small body of men could never satisfactorily represent people that they knew nothing about. So the big argument was, virtual representation versus, you might say physical representation. So there again, England says, no, you're going to pay the taxes, whereas the colonists say we're not going to pay the taxes unless we have our own representatives in British Parliament approve those taxes. Okay, so there again, now we're starting to see a standoff. We're starting to see these tensions begin to build. We start to see these tensions begin to grow over power and authority. So now this leads to defiant acts. This leads to militia groups. It leads to frustrated people. And so because of this, we now come to certain boycotts and protests. England issued many forms of taxation, such as the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Act. The Sugar Act was the first tax hike, which coming in 1764 when Parliament passed this. It taxed molasses and other imports like textiles, wine, coffee, indigo, and sugar. Colonists, of course, hated the Sugar Act because it was the first tax Parliament had ever levied on them solely to raise revenue. So, of course, this is extremely frustrating to the colonies. Now, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Sugar and Currency Acts did increase revenue. Britain needed much more money in order to pay off war debts and keep troops posted in the colonies, but to make up the difference, Grenville next proposed the Stamp Acts to tax printed matter and legal documents in the colonies, such as newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, bonds, license deeds, diplomas, and even playing cards. Americans despised the Stamp Act more than the Sugar Act or the Currency Act because it taxed items they deemed as necessities. More important, they also hated the tax because it challenged colonial assemblies' exclusive power to levy internal taxes. And eventually we would come in 1767 to Parliament passing the Townshend Act, which levied taxes on virtually all imports entering the colonies from Great Britain. Although the taxes did increase revenue, they sparked another round of fiery protest from the colonists. So, as a result of these taxes, you are going to have groups such as the Sons of Liberty. You're going to have Samuel Adams, who is the Bostonian revolutionary, launching citywide propaganda campaigns to protest the Townshend taxes. And he would distribute pamphlets, letters, and essays on the injustices of British rule. So he certainly has a lot of propagation going during this time period. Two notable events that's going to take place. Bostonians, of course, hated royal encroachments on colonial liberties and took their resentment out on the British soldiers garrisoned in the city. Crowds would taunt and jeer at the troops for months until the tense situation finally exploded. On March 5, 1770, several British soldiers fired into a crowd of rock-throwing colonists, killing 5 Bostonians. News of the Boston Massacre spread rapidly through the colonies. Hoping to avoid further bloodshed, Parliament repealed all the Townshend duties except for the tax on tea, mostly as a symbol of royal authority. There again, John Adams would be the defense attorney for the British troops, and there was reason behind this. John Adams became the attorney for the British troops because he was trying to set what you would say a precedent to say this, that even though there may be a dislike, there may be a disagreement with who might be within the country, but we still want to be a country with rights. We still want to be a country that promotes the right to an attorney. And so that is looking into the future, as John Adams could, and certainly his intelligence and intellect was much needed for the framing and the shaping of the government as far as the United States is concerned, and eventually would become once we defeat the British. But that just shows you the mastermind behind people like John Adams, who are considered or is considered a founding father. But yes, the Boston Massacre, there again is a bit of question. There again, there are two different primary sources or visuals that you see here. This visual is from Paul Revere. And if you see here, Paul Revere's outlook on it was making the British troops to be the ones who were what you would say the bullies. But there is also another visual as well that would show that it was the patriots, or the crowd, the citizens for that matter, or the colonists, let me say, not necessarily citizens, but colonists, who were the instigators. So it's always been kind of, a bit of disagreements as far as who started what. Another notable event took place December 16, 1773. Colonists would toss chests of tea overboard while disguised as Mohawk Indians in protest of the Townsend Act. So rebels like Sam Adams churned out more propaganda in response to the reduced tax and urged colonists to boycott tea. Port officials throughout the colonies refused to allow East India Company tea ships to unload their cargoes, forcing them to sail back to England. In Boston, however, Governor Hutchinson wouldn't allow the tea ships to return either, forcing them to remain in the port. Bostonians, Sons of Liberty, ended their stalemate on the night of December 16, 1773, when disguised as Mohawk Indians. And there's a reason why they are disguised as Mohawk Indians. There is nothing more native to America than, of course, the Native Americans. So they dress up as Mohawk Indians, not to disguise from the standpoint that they would throw the blame off on the Mohawk Indian, but that they wanted the British to relate or visualize them as they would a Native American, because they wanted to be just as native as the Native Americans. So that's one of the reasons why that there was a dressing up as far as Mohawk Indians. They boarded the tea ships, threw several hundred chests of tea into the harbor. Several hundred spectators watched the Boston Tea Party unfold and wondered how Britain would respond to such blatant defiance and royal authority. But it's just to show that there again, the colonists, the Sons of Liberty, are willing to engage in conflict, so to speak, or be willing to step up and show defiant acts in order to resist the power and authority within the colonies of that day. All right, by 1776, we do have the establishment of the Declaration of Independence. So we're jumping ahead here just a little bit. There, of course, was an olive branch petition first initiated that was rejected by the British. So delegates at the Second Continental Congress finally elected to declare independence from Britain on July 2nd, 1776. They then selected Thomas Jefferson to draft the Congress official Declaration of Independence. Some of the major themes, of course, grievances against King George III, their frustrations with him. Other mentionings in the Declaration of Independence is the most notable as far as the unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Jefferson kept the Declaration relatively short because he wanted to be direct, clear, and very forceful. Much of the drawings as far as the writings came from John Locke. Jefferson argued that governments exist in order to protect the rights of the people, and that the people have a right and even a duty to overthrow governments that fail their mandate. Those were sort of the thesis of the Declaration of Independence, along there again with those long train of abuses from King George III. That's July 4, 1776. Some of the long-term causes of the American Revolution. There again, we don't go into great detail with the American Revolution. That's more with American history. Long-term causes: discontent with foreign rule, mercantilism. Please remember mercantilism, tradition of self-government. They like the idea that they can govern themselves, and the more that Britain can get out of the way, the better that they like it. They also came for a reason, and that is preservation of civil liberties, and they don't like the whole idea of taxes. So overall, those were long-term causes of the American Revolution. Some of the short-term causes: shots fired at Lexington and Concord, the the shot heard around the world, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. There again, propaganda pieces to encourage the colonists to support the Declaration of Independence, and then of course the Declaration of Independence itself. So there again, we're well on our way to the defeating the British and the establishment of a governmental system. So it's going to take all of this taking place first before we can ever reach the whole idea of learning about government. So we're just moving right along here. All right, so we conclude here. We'll pick up with the remaining set of notes for 1.1 tomorrow, so stay tuned.